All right, so y'all find a seat because I've got to thread the needle this morning. I usually try to preach about 35 to 40 minutes, and this is a hard topic. I'm going to be honest with you. This is not an easy message, particularly in today's culture, today's environment. When I say to you, and I'm just going to hit just a few things that have been in the news here lately. When I say Ferguson, Missouri, when I say Freddie Gray, some of you don't even know necessarily, you don't track the news that closely, and you may not know what all this is. Black Lives Matter. Blue Lives Matter. Colin Kaepernick won't stand up for the national anthem. When I say things like Antifa and white nationalists, all of these things have been in the news here lately. I'm talking about this is all current stuff, last 6 months, 12 months, those kinds of things. There's a lot of division in our world. A lot of division. There's a lot of injustice in our world. A lot of things that are just, you look at it and you say, that ain't right. It's just not right. And you're right. It's not. What's a leader to do in that kind of world where there's so much division and anger and this side can't talk to that side? And honestly, sometimes you go over here and you listen to this side for a while and you're like, that's a good point. Then you go over and you listen to this side and you feel like the judge who was going to hear a case. He was going to hear a case on a divorce case between a husband and a wife. And he sat down and he said, all right, he said, sir, tell me your side of the story. And the man started talking and telling about all the things that on his side of the case. And the judge said, that's right, that's right, that's right. And the wife said, now wait a minute, you haven't heard my side yet? And he said, okay, ma'am, tell me your side of the story. And she said that she started telling her side and telling everything this guy had done and telling on him. And the judge said, that's right, that's right. And the attorney jumped in and said, wait a minute, they can't both be right. And the judge said, that's right, that's right. What do you do sometimes? You feel like you're stuck in the middle. I don't know how am I supposed to fix this? What am I supposed to do? What is a leader supposed to do? You know, followers can do anything they want. It doesn't take any energy to be a follower. You can just kind of pick your feet up and drift along with the current, right? As long as you don't have to fight anything or try to walk against the current, followers can do anything. You can listen to whatever side you want, and you can just jump in there and say, well, I'm going to be on this side right here and never pay attention. Just think that everybody on the other side is just a terrible, terrible person who just can't see the light of day. And by the way, the internet isn't doing anything to help this process. Have you read YouTube comments? If you don't believe that people are sinful, go read any YouTube comment section ever, and pretty soon you'll be like, yep, people are evil. Whew. This week, it's tough because sometimes you discover things that you're like, oh, people are stirring this pot. It's almost like some people have a vested interest in making sure both sides stay mad at each other. Am I making sense to you? That like this week, the news came out that Russia bought Facebook ads. The Russian government, Russian-sponsored organizations bought Facebook ads supporting both sides of the Black Lives Matter issue. Both sides. In other words, and they targeted the ads around Ferguson, Missouri. What? You know what they were trying to do? They're trying to raise the profile of both sides. Let's pick the most extreme voices and amplify them so the fight keeps on happening, because internal strife, internal struggle weakens a major geopolitical rival. That's what's going on there. Wow. So what's a What's a Christian to do? What's a leader to do? You want to be an influence. You want to be an influence for right. What are we supposed to do? Well, this is not new in our country. In fact, it's not even new in our state. This is a long-term thing. In fact, in 1910 in Tulsa, there was a significant race riot in 1910 in Tulsa. In fact, at that time, there was a situation where there was a part of Tulsa that had become known as Black Wall Street because some African American people had owned some land and they had discovered oil on that land that had thought to be worthless. It had been sold real cheap. They bought the land, they farmed the land, they discovered oil on the land, and they suddenly had money. And that part of Tulsa where these people lived and worked, and people that were attracted by that new wealth came in and started, black attorneys started law offices, and there were doctors, and there were jewelry stores, and it was kind of like a wealthy African American part of town. But in all honesty, there was a very, very serious situation that developed. There was a race riot. It started with newspaper reports that a black man had assaulted a white elevator operator. In fact, I've got a slide here from a picture from those days in Tulsa. This is a picture of several black businessmen standing in front of one of their businesses in 1910 in Tulsa, in the area called Black Wall Street. The young man was arrested. The young black man was arrested. And to prevent a lynching, a lot of African American people rushed together. A lot of men rushed together at the courthouse to try to make sure that justice was adequately served and there was appropriate legal processes that took place, because it wasn't always true in those days. And not always in these days either, that's true, yeah. Quickly, the law enforcement officers were suddenly fearful that something was going to get out of hand, and they quickly deputized a bunch of white people, handed out weapons, and things went downhill quickly from there. There's an account of this that was discovered back in the last few years, that was discovered in a storage unit. A typewritten account of this that had never been found before by a black lawyer who lived in Tulsa in those days. And he's several pages long as he described what he lived through in those days. And he talks about hearing thumps on the roof and hearing planes swooping low overhead. And there was a concerted effort by white people who owned planes. They came and they took turpentine balls and wadded up rags, dipped it in turpentine, set them on fire, and dropped them on the roofs of black businesses on Black Wall Street. And for 2 days, the Red Cross was kept out. The fire department didn't show up. And it was mob rule in that part of Tulsa for about 2 days. And this is a picture of what that part of town looked like after it was over. Now, so what I'm saying to you is that this is not something new. This is not something new. We've struggled with this before. And no matter which side does wrong, the other side always points to the wrong done by the other side. And there is wrong on both sides, especially on the extreme edges. And the media comes in because if they can get your eyeballs watching their show, they can charge twice as much for commercials. You do know that, right? And you know that media is a business, right? So as long as they get more people watching their show, they know they can charge more for commercial time and they make more money. And so bad news, it pays them to amplify voices way out on the edge of the argument instead of listening to the reasonable middle, because if you listen to the reasonable middle, it's not as interesting. Am I making sense? And so it feeds itself, and it's a difficult thing. 35 blocks were destroyed in Tulsa, along with more than 1,200 homes. 300 people died, mostly African Americans. The National Guard was called out. The governor declared martial law, imprisoned all African American people that were not already in jail. 6,000 people were put into prison. Some were held as long as 8 days before being released. What do we do when injustice happens? Well, let's go to the book of Nehemiah. All right? Maybe I've kind of whetted your appetite to talk about what about injustice. Nehemiah chapter 5, we're going to start reading with verse number 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Now I'll push pause here for just a moment and say it isn't just racial tension that causes injustice to happen. In this situation, it's Jews against Jews, right? In this situation, it's one race and they're still butting heads together. You know why? Greed, right? Greed. That's what's happening here. Let's look at it. Others are saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. So you get the picture. There's an economic downturn, right? Times are hard, and in order to live while they're waiting for the famine to be over, while they're trying to scratch out enough living to eat while the crops aren't growing well, they're borrowing just to live. They're borrowing grain from people who are more wealthy and they've got it stored up, and in the process, they're saying, now I'll loan you this grain. How are you going to guarantee you're going to pay me back? Well, I mean, I can't. Well, what about your field? If you don't pay me back, can I have your field? Well, I mean, I don't really want to give up my field. Well, then I'm not loaning you the grain. Well, I guess okay, you can have a lien on my field, and so they're charging them interest. And well, now what about if I'm going to lend you this grain, you need to pay it back plus 20%, right? If I'm loaning you 5 bushels, you need to pay me back 6. And in a famine time, how are they supposed to grow that, right? And do you see how the cycle can get going, and after a while it just perpetuates itself? You don't even have to try. It just is automatic. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our field and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, although our sons and daughters are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. And I'll stop and say, slavery sometimes in those days was an indentured slavery that was temporary. It was like, I will in advance sell you 5 years of my work, or I'll sell you a year of my labor, or something like that. And so, well, I mean, I've got to work the farm, but I've got a boy here, he's strong, I'll sell 3 years of his work to you so we can eat. Does that make sense? And so it was kind of an awkward situation, even if it wasn't straight up slavery as we know it now. It was still pre-selling your work for a period of time. Yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we're powerless because our fields and vineyards belong to others. So they loan you the money, they loan you the grain, and then they expect it back with interest. You can't pay it, so they take your fields. Then they let you work the fields, but you have to pay them 30% of whatever the field brings in. The rich get richer, the poor keep getting poor. Am I making sense? It creates this gap. You see the problem, right? Keeping other people down just because that's the way it's always been done, and that's what was going on in this situation. Now, in our world, we are Americans, right? We're Americans, and we emphasize personal responsibility, don't we? Everybody say yes. All right, we do. We emphasize personal responsibility and ownership and my area and my territory and personal rights and personal responsibility. You say, whenever somebody starts coming over in my lane on the interstate and they just like swerve over in my lane, they get 2 tires over in my area, I have a line I always say, and my wife will know this is true. I say, hey, my lane, not ours, right? Because in America, we automatically assume this is my space. I'm in it first. It's my space. You get your own space. Go over there. And I also expect them to take care of their space too, right? I don't want you being crazy over there. I know that's your lane, but you don't get to drive 95 miles an hour. You don't get to do that. You don't get to text while driving 95 miles an hour. You don't get to do that. I expect you to be responsible, because we emphasize personal responsibility. Part of our culture. It is way down and deep in the American psyche. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that there is another part of injustice. And so when all we can do, when we look at injustice and all we can do is say, well, they should have worked harder. If all we can do is say, well, they should have saved up for the king's taxes. It happens every year. They knew it was coming. They should have saved up for it. Well, they should have thought of that before they sold their son into slavery. They should have thought of the fact that he was going to get sick and then not be able to keep the farm because he had sold his son's work to the guy so he could pay and feed his family. He should have thought of that. I understand that personal responsibility is important, but what I'm saying is that when all we do is personal responsibility, we do miss another piece of the puzzle, and that piece of the puzzle is there is some injustice. There can be systemic injustice in the world, even if it's painful for you and me to think about. And it is painful. It is hard. It is not an easy set of thoughts to have, to think about systemic injustice. Institutionalized, legalized injustice. What these guys were doing was legal, right? I mean, they could do it. In one scene in the movie Selma, Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleagues are strategizing. They're together, they're having a conversation, they're strategizing about the best way to make progress in the right of black people to vote. And the conversation as they go kind of takes a dive down into the maze of institutionalized racism, denying that and how it creates other injustices in that one right. For instance, there's a scene in that movie where a black character comes to apply to get to be able to vote, to register to vote. And the person behind the counter doesn't want to allow that, and so they say, we're going to require you to not only say the preamble to the Constitution, but also quote and like adding these things to it, say they just created an institutionalized rule to prevent that from happening. You know why? In the process of this, white brutality in those days against black people was rarely brought to justice. And the reason it was brought to justice was rarely brought to justice is because juries were white. You know why juries were white? Because the reason juries were white is because you had to be registered to vote to serve on a jury. And you couldn't be registered to vote unless you could read. Because you had to be able to read and memorize some things and answer some questions and write. Am I making sense? You see the process and the way it goes, and so all sorts of injustices sometimes flow out of differences and inequality, and it can be a challenging thing to root out. Now, I know all of this is rooted in the sin of racism in the human heart. I know that is true. But as a leader, what can we do? What can we do to address this in our world? As Christians, how do we address this inside our world? There's you say, well, that was back in the 60s. I wasn't even alive back in the 60s. You know, I mean, that was Martin Luther King Jr. days, and I wasn't responsible for those people. I know that's true. But again, that's personal responsibility talking too, isn't it? Right? It's just one piece of the picture. Recently, let me show you just one simple way in which this can work. Recently, they did a study where they brought in trained people. They did this specifically for the study. They trained a white person, an African American person, a Hispanic person, and an Asian person. They trained them, and they would send them into a city, and they would have them ask to look at homes. They would ask to look at properties. They would ask them about their budget, and they would dress them in the similar way, so there wasn't like a big difference in dress. And they would claim that their income was in very similar veins. So they would claim it was all in the same. They were all in the same level. just to be able to isolate the factor of just race on home things. The people who were white were shown more homes. People of color were shown 20 or 30% fewer homes than the white people. Now, you say, it's just one real estate agent. They conducted 8,000 tests in 28 different cities. And on average, people of color were shown 30% less fewer homes. It wasn't just African Americans either. Asian Americans were shown 20% less. There was a significant measurable difference in the way a professional realtor responded to people, simply based on that one factor. Now you say, well, that's not really that big a deal. I mean, they're shown fewer houses. Well, but if you add up those kind of things in 1,000 different areas, you know that home buying is a big key to wealth building, right? It's like a path to future doing well, so you leave it to your kids, and your kids wind up better off than you were when you know what I'm saying? Like it compounds over the course of time. It's a key to breaking out of generational poverty. There's another study. A guy named, a sociologist named Ayres, last name was Ayres. He was trying to zero in on a very specific question. If everything else is equal, how does skin color or gender affect the price that a car salesman offers the buyer? And so he did this. He took a white male, a white female, an African-American male, African-American female, and sent them into car dealerships to inquire about a price on the same car. All right? So he did this with numerous places, more than one dealership. He did this study. And here's what he found. White men received initial offers from the salesman that were $725 above the dealer's invoice. In other words, what the car dealer originally paid for the car. So they offered them a $700 price $700 above the dealer invoice immediately. White women got initial offers $935 above invoice. So the first offer they would make is they would offer the female a higher price than they offered the white male. Black women were quoted on average a price $1,195 above the dealer's invoice. And black men's initial offer was $1,687 above the dealer's price. On average, that's the way it went down. Now, you say, but that isn't me. What I'm saying is, how do we respond as Christians in a world where that does happen and that is in existence, and they try to control for it and watch for it and say, let's isolate this and say, what is the effect of race on these kinds of things? What do we do? How do we respond in a world like that? After lengthy negotiations, I forgot to give you this stat. Black men only got the price down after 40 minutes of bargaining to only $1,551 on average above invoice. In other words, after 40 minutes of negotiating, the black males in that study ended up with a price that they were being offered $800 higher than the first price that the white male was offered. Now, all of that to say, is this conscious? Is this somehow conscious, like, hey, people are mean, car dealers, they're mean, horrible people? No, I really don't think so. Now, you may think car dealers, especially used car salesmen, are mean, but they're not all terrible people. Am I saying that all these people that everybody is? No, I'm not saying that everybody's racist. I'm not. What I am saying is that it's probably unconscious, and that's why it's hard to even talk about. Because as long as I can brush it off and say, well, it's not me, I don't have an issue. I don't have a problem. As long as I can brush that off, I don't have to deal with the pain of thinking about it. And I know this is a hard conversation to have. Okay, so just stick with me because we're going somewhere. I promise. Okay? What is a leader to do? Number one, if you're taking notes, it is the job of leadership to confront injustice. It is the job of leadership to confront injustice. Verse 6 of Nehemiah, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. And I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. And I told them, you are exacting usury. That word is interest. It's like exorbitant interest. You are exacting usury from your own countrymen. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them. And I said, as far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Hey, you've tried to rescue people from slavery yourself, right? Now you're selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us. They used to be slaves to the Gentiles, now they're slaves to you. He's saying, he's confronting an injustice. And they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. I'm thankful, truly thankful, for leaders that God has called out in our culture and in our history to stand up against injustice. I'm grateful for that, truly, truly thankful. And while I may not agree with every single one of those leaders on every single issue and every single thing that ought to be done, I am grateful for leaders that step up and say, this is unjust. I want to read you a segment from Martin Luther King Jr. Right after one of his big speeches. He was in an interview with Meet the Press, and here's what he said. He said, there are two types of laws. One is a just law, and one is an unjust law. And I think we have a moral obligation to obey just laws. We do. On the other hand, he said, I think we have a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws because non-cooperation with evil is as much of a moral obligation as cooperation with good. I refuse to cooperate with evil, and that's a good thing. Yeah, that's what he's saying. I think the distinction here is that when one breaks the law, his conscience tells him he is unjust. He must do it openly, cheerfully, lovingly, and do it civilly, not uncivilly, and he must do it with a willingness to accept the penalty. Now, this is Martin Luther King Jr.'s doctrine of passive resistance, of the idea of willingly breaking an unjust law and then be willing to accept the penalty, as he did and spent significant time in jail for things. He said, any man who breaks a law that his conscience tells him is unjust and then willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail in order to arouse the conscience of the community on the injustice of that law is at that moment expressing the highest respect for law. Now that is brilliant. That is absolutely true. When you say, this law is not just, I will break that law openly, willingly. I'm not covering my face with a ski mask. By the way, that's not the way to do it, right? It's not the way to do it. I'm not calling for anarchy. Neither are responsible people whose leaders who stand up against injustice. They're not calling for anarchy. They're calling for justice. And there's a difference between the two. You willingly break the law and then take the penalty, and people say, that's not fair, that's not right. You've expressed high regard for justice and truth and the highest regard for moral law. So, in those ways, how do we confront injustice in our world? How do you confront injustice where you live and where you work? It's a hard thing to say. I do tell you this. If you see it, sometimes you'll know it and you'll recognize it. The more sensitized you are to this issue, the more you'll start to see it from time to time. You say, oh, I never noticed that before. I'll be honest with you. I was raised in a place and a time, I was raised in the South. I was raised in a completely white world. Completely white. Everybody around me, it was automatic, it was natural. I didn't have any African American friends. I didn't have any Mexican. I remember the first time I went to a Mexican restaurant as a teenager. Because Taco Bell doesn't count, all right? So let's put that one aside. Taco Bell, that's not Mexican food, all right? So let's put that aside. I remember the first time, and I was like, what is this that they're putting in front of me? And then I tried it, and it was like, oh, it's actually pretty good. And I ate it. So, and I look back now, and I can see now, in retrospect, ways in which my perspective was shaped and changed and colored by that. And I didn't see things as I do now in the same way. And so sometimes confronting injustice means you got to look in the mirror. Okay, you got to look in the mirror and say, you know what? I'm not sure that I'm quite as just as I once thought I was. And I've had to do that. Yeah. And then sometimes it means confronting injustice among your circle of acquaintances. When someone is doing something that's not appropriate, it's not just, it's not right, it's not true. Sometimes it means calling it out and saying, you know, that's actually not true. That stereotype isn't actually real. That law was that story is not really true. Being able to confront that and step up and boldly just speak the truth, rather than just picking up your feet and going along with the current of whatever's happening at that moment. I have a pastor friend who pastored in Alabama for years. And he was riding in a car with this man at one point. He passed by a schoolyard with black and white children playing together. And as he drove past, this man said, now preacher, he said, don't get me wrong. He said, I believe, and he used a pejorative term, a slur for African American people. He said, I believe they have a place. I believe they have a soul. He said, I believe they got a soul, but I also believe they got a place, and that ain't it right there. Do you see what I'm saying? There may be times where you run across conversations and you realize, you know what? I'm going to stand up for the person that's not here. I'm going to stand up for the marginalized. I'm going to stand up for those who are pushed aside and cast aside, because I'm going to stand up for equal opportunity for all people. I know equal status takes time to achieve. Equal levels, equal income those kind of things take time, and there's ways in which you may not be able to affect that, but you can choose to stand up for right and equal freedom for all people. Right? Number 2, it is the job of leadership to work toward reconciliation. Now this is one more level on top of that. Let's look at verse 9. So I, Nehemiah, continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? Push pause. Okay. Let me just tell you this. Martin Luther King Jr. was correct when he said 10 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour in America. Oh my. It still is. And you know what? It should not be so, should it? I mean, it shouldn't be so. The truth is that we need each other, and we need the perspectives that each person brings. We have American Indian here, we have black and white and Hispanic, and I love it. I love it. That's beautiful. I think it reflects beautifully on Him who created all of us. And so let it not be that the people of Jesus bring reproach on the name of the Creator by pushing aside or subconsciously shoving aside those who He created, He made. Verse 10, I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let the exacting of usury stop. Okay, what they were doing is they're saying, hey, we're lending grain too, we're just not charging interest. We're just not charging them any interest. So we're giving them a genuine hand up. Like they can, hey, use this grain. It's not like I'm going to be eating it right now. Here you go. Use it, and may God help it to bless you and help you get through this hard time so you can get to the other side of this and still be on your feet. What a different approach, right? Jesus said, when you lend money, lend without expecting to get it back. That's profound, isn't it? That's almost like giving instead of lending, isn't it? Now, so here's what I do. I tell people I don't lend money. I don't. There's a few people who at one time or another borrowed from me, and I'll tell you, I don't lend money. I don't lend money. If I can't afford to give it back, to not get it back, you know what I'm saying? If I can't afford to not receive it back, I just don't give it. All right? Because if I can't afford it, then that's not, because I want to lend without expecting to give it back. Some of you have gotten crossways with family members and friends because you lent money that you couldn't afford to not get back. And then they don't pay it back. And then everything goes south in that relationship, doesn't it? Because the borrower is slave to the lender, right? And everything goes. So instead, what if we changed our attitude toward one another and said, we're going to change this. Let the exacting of usury stop. Give them back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, and also the interest you're charging, the 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil. Wow, they were only charging them 1%. Woo. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. So I summoned the priest and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. And I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way may God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep his promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied. And at this point the whole assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. He put it right. He fought for reconciliation. Let's bring the divided parties, those that are pushed apart by economic differences, let's bring them together, and let's bring them together on the foundation of truth and justice and righteousness. Ours as Americans, ours as Methodists, has always been a proud history of standing up for truth and justice. Wesleyans and Methodists have been this way, Wesleyan Methodists particularly, but where the Bible Methodists come from, have always been like this. In fact, you may not know the story there are famous people, inspiring stories. Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a woman who was born Isabella Baumfree. She grew up as a slave in New York. She escaped in 1862, 1 year before Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. She was a very courageous woman. Her son was sold into slavery and transported to Alabama. She went to Alabama, found him, and as a free woman, she took him to court in Alabama and won her son's freedom. The first black woman to ever win a court case against a white man. She was absolutely a courageous person. But she became a Methodist in 1843, and on June the 1st of 1843, she heard a call to God to become a traveling preacher, preaching against slavery. And she renamed herself, she said she got the name from the Lord, Sojourner, which means temporary stay. She stays just temporarily. She traveled from place to place. Sojourner Truth, she called herself. She traveled around preaching against the evils of slavery and bondage. She said, when somebody said, why are you leaving your job? Why are you leaving your security and doing this? She said, the Spirit calls me and I must go. Yeah. We have a proud history of this. In fact, there's another slide I have here. This is a picture of Luther's Rock. It's on the farm of John Brown, the famous abolitionist, John Brown's body and all that. And the Luther Lee, who was a Wesleyan Methodist, stood on this rock near John Brown's grave and preached a 3-hour-long message against slavery. True story. He stood on that rock. That's Dr. Kaufman. Some of you know Dr. Kaufman. He preached here at our church. He's a historian. He studies church history. And one of his documents he had to write for his doctoral studies, his papers, was on Luther Lee and his fight against slavery. And so he went to the Luther Lee's rock and took a picture beside it. Luther Lee preached a 3-hour-long message against slavery standing on top of that rock. There were about 1,000 people gathered in that open field, and he preached a 3-hour message. I'm not going to preach 3 hours today. I'm not going to do it, all right? But I thought about it. I did think about it. Just like old times, right? I'm going to keep going. Standing up for reconciliation. Our goal as Christians is to reach out and reconcile all things back to God. His mission in the world is to reconcile all things back to Himself. And as much as possible, our goal is to say, we want to bring together those whose society would push apart. So maybe Russia is out there buying Facebook ads to try to drive people apart. Our job as Christians is to stand up and say, we will be a voice for unity. We will be a voice for reason, truth, and justice, and we will stand up for the right of those who are not heard. We will do that. Number 3, the job of leadership is to lead by example. Look at verse 14. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. So here's the deal. When the king would send a governor into that land, he would say, all right, all you people, this is your new governor. You got to pay him. You got to give him a part of your produce so he'll have something to eat and he can feed all his people. They would demand the king would say, you have to give some of your produce to this guy. For 12 years, Nehemiah came in and as the governor didn't take his required salary. Like they were supposed to give it to him and he wouldn't take it. Oh, God, give us leaders like this. Give us leaders like this. Do you look at Washington and you ever say, ugh? Because people go up there and then they're all about their own power and their own wealth and their own goodness and their own... The guy this week who it came out that he spent like $500,000 on travel, on jet fares, on private jets and all this stuff, already since taking office. In 6 months, $500,000. What is going on, people? You know what? You know that Congress and the Senate, you know they don't actually take Social Security, right? You know that they're not on Social Security? You know what their retirement plan is? This is true. When somebody from the Congress or the Senate retires, they just keep drawing the same pay until they die. No, that's true. I take it back. They do get occasional cost of living increases. That's a true story. You go and you serve in the Senate, and after you're done serving in the Senate, you can go work for a private corporation, and your congressional salary keeps coming. Well, no wonder they don't fix stuff. They don't feel any pain. Right? And you say, what is this business of leaders are here and the followers are way down here? What is that? Oh, God, give us leaders like this. Now, let me bring this back home to maybe a little bit closer to home in some ways. What about dads in your family? Is the biggest piece of cake always yours? Right? Do you use your position? Now, I'm the biggest. Mine is the biggest, but it's based on weight. Is that what it is? Okay, all right. So, do you use your position to make your life comfortable, or do you use it to serve the people? Right? Do you use it to enforce your good, or do you use it to enforce justice for the people you follow? The people who follow you. Yeah. Try that again. Yeah. Verse 15, but the earlier governors, those preceded me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to the food and wine. The governors who were before Nehemiah, they didn't just take the food. They were like, oh yes, and also there's a governor's tax, right? They were getting rich off this. And look what he says, their assistants also lorded it over the people, but out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Out of reverence for God. Oh, that God would give us servant leaders at every level of government, at every level of family, at every level of our churches. Oh, Lord, help me, please. Your leadership position is not a right to lord it over the people. It is an opportunity to serve the people. Bless your wife, guys. Bless her. She's supposed to follow you, right? Bless her. Bless her. Take care of her. Watch out for her. Use your position not to make your life better, but to serve. Verse 16, instead I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled. We did not acquire any land. There were no sweetheart real estate deals, right? Verse 17, furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table. as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 sheep, and some poultry were prepared for us, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people." And then he says, "Remember me with favor, O my God, for all I have done for these people." How can we lead by example? I want to close with this story. There was a researcher who was doing positive association testing. Now, you may not know what positive association testing is, so let me tell you. Here's what they do. They'll take a picture, they'll flash a picture for just a split second on the screen, and then they will give you 2 words, a positive word and a negative word, and you're supposed to choose just in a moment reaction what word you want to pick. And they don't give you requirements you have to do. They just give you a quick picture, and then they give you a positive word and a negative word, and you have to push one button, the positive button or the negative button. They use this to measure reactions to various situations and people. The reason they do it is because if they just come up and ask people, "Hi, are you a racist?" Nobody says yes, right? If you take a survey, the number is abysmally small of people who answer yes to that question. So they use other kinds of associations, and what they find is that when they prime people with a quick picture of a person of their race, people are far more likely to choose a positive word immediately after it. If they prime a white person with an African American picture, a person of African American descent in the picture, they're far more likely to choose a negative word following that picture. And they use this to try to measure attitudes. Even the researchers who know this is true they never get a positive score. So the white researcher was doing this work. He was doing this research, and he said, "I would test myself occasionally." He said, "I do this for a living, and I never get a positive association score." He said, I don't do it. I take it, and I take the test and just try to be as gut reaction as I can. He said, "I'd never get a positive association for African American people." Now, one day, he woke up, he went into the office, and he did a test on himself, and he got a positive association. And he was like, it blew me away. He's like, he said, "I never do this. I got a positive association score with African American faces. How did I do this? What happened?" And here's what happened. He got to thinking about it, and he said, "You know what? Last night, I spent 4 hours watching track and field at the Olympics." Yeah, I heard the through the. You know what happened. For 4 hours the night before, he saw people of color from various nations. He saw them in places of strength. He saw them in roles of excellence. He saw them in places of victory. He rejoiced with them as they celebrated their win. He saw them in places that it meant something to them. And you know how it is when you see somebody win a tough race and the guy leans into the tape and he barely wins and he's celebrating, and the people in his section of the grandstands are cheering and waving their flag, and he watched it for 4 hours, and the next morning he got a positive association score for the very first time. Now, I'm going to take that story from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, which is really good, by the way. I'm going to take that story and pull it out, and I want to say that if you want to be a leader who builds bridges instead of walls, in our culture, in a culture that is heavily divided, if you want to be a leader who builds bridges instead of walls, here's what you do. You go on purpose and you associate with people that you want to have a positive impression of. You go and you build bridges and you talk to them and you ask them about their story and you see them as real people. And you get on the other side of that divide and you go talk to that actual person. And you go say, I'd like to know about your story. I'd like to hear your story. I'd like to learn about you. And the more you love that person, the more you know that person, the more you love them on purpose, the more you become a leader in building bridges instead of building walls. Can we, in America, conquer this long-standing weight around our ankle of injustice. By God's grace, not only can we, but we will. We will. If God's people, if you and me will rise up and say, I choose to go and find and build bridges and associate and reach out. I choose to be the person who steps out of the crowd and walks over across the room and says, I'd like to associate with you. I'd like to be your friend. I'd like to love you. I'd like to see Jesus reflected in you. I'd like to place value on your life. It'll make a difference. And our culture, literally our culture will shift. Give it a few years. Give it a few years. It'll happen. So, my friend, I choose, no matter the color of your skin, I choose to see you. I choose to see you as Jesus sees you. No matter what language you once spoke, I choose not to mouth off about press 1 for English. I shouldn't have to press 1 for English. This is America. I choose instead to love you and to care about you and to rejoice in you and the value that God has placed upon you by making you, by dying for you. And He's done the same for me. We're brothers and we're sisters because we believe we ought to love God, love others, and serve the world. So let's do it together. All right? Let's bow our heads together for prayer.